Single mom saved a bleeding man in her garage hours. Later, Mafia boss woke up, said, "I owe you." October in Charleston is usually no more than a slow, persistent drizzle, but tonight was different. Rain came down in sheets, so thick it was like a curtain drawn across the windshield, and my wipers couldn't keep up. I had been driving for more than 20 minutes in a kind of trance, my mind still reeling from the surgery that had just ended. The German Shepherd didn't make it. Despite everything I did, despite 3 straight hours of cutting, stitching, and silently pleading, his heart gave out at exactly 2:47 in the morning. I pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine, letting the sudden silence settle around me. The house looked exactly as it had 16 hours earlier when I left. Dark and cold. It was an old 2-story place, the one my parents used to live in before the accident. It has been 5 years, but sometimes I still half expect to see the soft glow of the kitchen light spilling out through the window, or catch a glimpse of my mother's figure moving behind the curtain. The rain showed no sign of letting up. I grabbed my bag from the passenger seat and ran for the porch. It took only 10 seconds, but it was enough to soak me through. My surgical scrubs were already stained with blood and the sharp scent of antiseptic. Now cold rain had soaked into the fabric, clinging to my skin. All I wanted was a long, hot shower. Hot enough to wash away the exhaustion that had wrapped itself around me. And then I saw it. A dark streak across the concrete near the side door to the garage. At first I thought it was oil, left over from the last repair, but the color wasn't right. Too dark, too thick. And it wasn't just sitting still. It had trailed, pulling itself toward the door. I froze on the steps, keys still in hand, eyes locked on that strange mark. Every logical thought I had screamed at me to go inside, lock the door, call the police, let someone else deal with it. But I've spent the past decade learning to read wounds, to gauge damage, to understand the thin line between survival and death. That much blood, still fresh enough not to have been washed away by the rain, could mean only one thing. Someone was badly hurt, and they had chosen my garage as the place to fall. You're listening to a story from Dear Single Mom, a channel where the most honest and moving moments of life are shared with deep emotion and compassion. If this story has stirred something within you, please consider subscribing, giving it a like, and sharing the video so that the message of love and connection can reach even more hearts. Where are you listening from? Leave us a comment below and let us know where you call home, whether it's a quiet corner somewhere in the heart of America or a bustling city aglow with lights. Thank you for being with us through these quiet yet deeply emotional moments. And now, let's continue with the next part of the story. I stepped slowly down the porch steps, the rain pounding hard against the tin roof like a heavy drumbeat striking straight into my chest. In my head, a voice whispered, "Let it go. Pretend you saw nothing. Go inside. Lock the door. Deal with it in the morning." But I couldn't. I'm not the kind of person who turns away from something that might still be holding on to life. The trail of blood led me to the side door of the garage, the one I rarely locked because Mrs. Patterson's cat from next door often sneaks in to hide when it rains. I reached into the trunk and pulled out the flashlight I always keep tucked away in the glove compartment, then stepped closer to the door that was slightly ajar. The beam of light sliced through the rain as the car's faint yellow glow lit up the concrete. The blood had spread wider than I expected, like a dark red ribbon stretching right up to the door's edge. The scent of iron and something raw mixed with the damp air, making it hard to breathe. I pushed the garage door open. It creaked the way it always does, but tonight, the sound scraped like a scream. The garage looked the same as it always had when I parked the car in there, still cluttered with unopened boxes left over after my parents passed, thick with the smell of old engine oil, damp cardboard, and the cold metallic scent of my father's tools still hanging on the back wall. But in the flashlight's beam, there was something different. Blood. More of it. The trail had pooled into a dark puddle in the center of the floor. I swept the light across the space without thinking, and then I saw the man. He was curled up between a stack of winter tires and the rusted lawnmower. His head leaned back against the wall, body slumped, one hand pressed hard against his side. What he wore looked all wrong for this place. A high-end suit torn to shreds, the white shirt now a soaked patchwork of red. I had no idea who he was or why he was here, but I knew one thing without a doubt. He was dying. My hand trembled as I raised the light to his face. It was a sharp face, the kind carved from stone. A strong jaw, high cheekbones, black hair plastered to his forehead with sweat. Even unconscious, there was something about him, something dangerous, magnetic, inexplicable. I dropped to my knees beside him, fingers searching for a pulse at his neck. It was there, but faint. His heart was racing, far too fast. I placed my hand on his forehead, His skin was cold and damp. The wound was on his left side, just below the ribs, where his hand clutched tight. I gently pulled his hand away. The fabric clung to the injury, blood soaking through layer by layer. It was a gunshot, small, clean, just below the stomach. I quickly checked his back, looking for an exit wound, but found none. The bullet was still inside. I sat back fully on the freezing concrete. My mind screamed to call the police, call an ambulance, get someone who could handle this the right way. But my instinct said something else. I'm a veterinarian. I've stitched up dogs with gut wounds from hunting rifles, performed emergency surgery on cats with shattered hips from being hit by cars, saved a deer once after a stray bullet pierced its ribs. I know anatomy. I know blood, trauma, how to hold a life together in its most fragile moments. What I don't know is how to do it for a human being, especially not a strange man, shot and hiding in my garage on a cold, rainy night. But I looked at him, his blood still flowing, his body trembling from the cold, and I knew, if I did nothing, he would die. Not in 10 minutes, not in an hour, right now, right here, on the cold concrete floor, and I couldn't let that happen. Even if I got arrested, even if this was madness, I jumped to my feet and ran into the house, my heart pounding like a war drum. I would need gloves, a scalpel, gauze, painkillers, antibiotics meant for a large dog, and the bottle of whiskey I kept on the kitchen shelf. Not for him, for me, because my hands were shaking too hard to hold the light steady. And I was about to do the craziest thing I had ever done in my life. Try to save a dying man, with the hands of a veterinarian, in my own garage, on a cold, rain-soaked night in Charleston. I returned to the garage with 2 bags full of supplies. The flashlight clipped to my collar flickered slightly with each breath, casting a nervous glow that shook with me. Beneath the cold, damp concrete, the man still lay there, motionless. Blood kept seeping through the crumpled shirt, spreading into a distorted shape against the floor. I knelt beside him, opened the bags, and began doing something I never thought I would attempt on a human being. But theory is still theory, and whether it's a dog, a cat, or a man, when a body is bleeding and time is counted in minutes, instinct is the only thing left to hold on to. I cut away the blood-soaked shirt, exposing the left side of his abdomen. The wound was still bleeding, but not spurting, which meant the aorta hadn't been hit. That was the only moment of relief I would get. I pressed gauze tightly to the bullet hole, one hand already reaching into the bag for antibiotics and an anesthetic. I had no medication approved for human use, but I did have ketamine intended for large dogs. I paused, calculating the dosage based on what I guessed his weight might be, then injected it into the side of his hip. As the needle entered, his body twitched, and a low groan escaped between clenched teeth. I froze, eyes on his face, now slick with sweat and rain. But still, his eyes remained shut. It was better that way. I didn't know if I had the courage to continue if I had to meet a fully conscious gaze while doing this. I began widening the wound to assess it. Without proper instruments, I used a hemostat designed for dogs, trying my best not to cause further harm. In the dim, yellow light of the garage, everything trembled: the beam, my hands, my breath. After a few minutes of careful searching, I touched metal. The bullet wasn't buried too deep. It could be removed. I inhaled deeply, slid the forceps in, clamped tight, and pulled it out in one clean motion. Blood gushed for a second, but not violently. I quickly pressed gauze to the site, firm and steady, then began stitching layer by layer. My hands were trembling, but the stitches were precise. I had sewn hundreds of wounds before, but never had each loop of thread felt so heavy. When it was done, I collapsed to the floor beside him, arms aching, heart still thudding wildly in my chest. I looked down at the man on the concrete. The bullet was out. The wound was closed. The bleeding had stopped, but his body was still cold. His lips were turning a faint shade of blue. I couldn't leave him lying here. I went back inside, grabbed blankets, and patted the old folding cot I kept in the garage, used mostly for late nights spent fixing the car. I pulled him up onto it, his body heavy and limp like a sandbag. Once he was settled, head resting on a pillow, I saw his face clearly for the first time in decent light. It was a face that had seen things: thick brows, long lashes, high cheekbones. Beneath the dried blood and dust, his skin was a dusky tone, with faint scars lining his neck and jaw. This man had lived through more than just one gunshot. He wasn't someone ordinary. The question kept circling in my head, over and over. Why was he here, in my garage, at night, wounded, alone? What was he running from? I washed my hands, cleaned up the tools, pulled over a small chair, and sat by the cot, watching his breathing. Still there, still steady, though weak. I laid my hand on his forehead, still cold, but no longer clammy. A while later, I let my back rest against the wall behind me, exhaling hard. Outside, the rain hadn't let up. Wind still moved through the trees. The clock neared 4 in the morning. I didn't know whether I had just saved a good man or let something dangerous into my life. But I knew one thing for certain. When morning came, my life would no longer be the same. I sat with my back against the wall, my hands still carrying the scent of antiseptic and dried blood, my heart beating so fast it echoed in my head. That emergency surgery had lasted no more than 40 minutes, but it felt like I had lived through an entire lifetime. The flashlight clipped to my collar cast a narrow, trembling halo around the man lying on the folding cot. I checked the stitches again, the bandages, the IV line, everything was holding, at least for now. He was still unconscious, but his breathing had steadied, no longer ragged or twitching. I knew I had made it past the most dangerous part, but the most terrifying part still lay ahead. I had just committed something illegal. I didn't call the police. I didn't alert emergency services. I used veterinary medication on a human, performed surgery in my garage. If anyone found out, I could lose everything: my license, my clinic, even custody of my daughter. But when I looked at that man, I knew there had never really been another option. He would have died if I had hesitated for even one more minute. I exhaled slowly and bent down to pick up the bullet, which had landed in a small tin tray nearby. It was small, heavy, still slick with blood, its dull brass surface catching the low light. A clean, smooth round, not something an ordinary person would carry. I wrapped it in a tissue and tucked it away in the bottom drawer of my workbench. Whether it would turn out to be evidence or a clue, I didn't know yet, but instinct told me not to throw it away. After cleaning up, I realized my whole body was shaking. The rain still tapped against the tin roof, but now it didn't sound like background noise anymore. It felt like a warning, a quiet signal that something had shifted, that life was slowly slipping out of its familiar orbit. I stood, peeled off the gloves, took off my soaked and bloodied surgical blouse, and tossed it into the metal bin. The scent of blood still lingered thick in the air, blending with antiseptic, rusted metal, old oil. It was a strange mixture, both familiar and foreign. I poured myself a glass of whiskey, the last bottle I had left from the days when my ex-husband was still around. I took a sip, just enough to send a trail of heat down my chest. I needed to stay clear-headed. Morning was coming. In just a few hours, my daughter would wake up. She'd ask why I hadn't gone to bed. She'd ask who was sleeping in the garage. I would need to have answers, or at least a lie that sounded like the truth. But looking at that man again, I knew there was no lie that could fully cover this. I pulled another blanket over him, checked his pulse one more time. His heart was still racing, but steady. The wound wasn't leaking. I sat down on the small wooden stool beside the cot, watching in silence. The first light of dawn began to slip through the cracks in the door, revealing details I hadn't seen in the dark. His hands were large, calloused but clean, and a thin scar ran along his wrist and disappeared up his forearm. Beneath the torn shirt, there were more scars, older, deeper, darkened by time. This man had seen real battles, not accidents, not misfortune, battles. He wasn't ordinary. I leaned in to listen to his breath, slow and steady, then looked toward the window, where the sky was shifting to a pale gray. I asked myself who I had just saved. Was he an innocent man who'd been hurt, or a dangerous one on the run? But no matter who he was, I had saved his life, and that meant I had just tied myself to a story I didn't understand yet. When the clock struck 6, the rain began to ease. I stood, locked the garage door from the inside, leaving him to rest. I needed sleep, just 1 hour, before I had to become a mother again, get my daughter ready for school, head to the clinic, pretend everything was still the same. But as I stepped out of the garage, I couldn't help but glance back. That stranger, lying on my father's old cot, in this garage full of memories, was the sign that my quiet life had just officially come to an end. And I had a feeling that when he opened his eyes, nothing in my small world would ever be the same again. I woke to the sun already high in the sky, pale golden light filtering through the curtains and casting soft patterns on the ceiling. The clock read just before 8. My body felt leaden, as though someone had pulled me from a restless, broken sleep laced with fragments of dreams too tangled to remember. I sat up from the couch where I had dozed off, and in an instant, it all came rushing back. The garage, the stranger, the wound, the bullet. A cascade of jagged memories assembled themselves in my mind like puzzle pieces forced into place. I shot to my feet, hurried down the hallway, and opened the door leading into the garage. Morning light streamed through the small window above, enough to see the cot was still there, exactly where I had left it. The man was still lying on it, but he was no longer unconscious. He was awake, and watching me. His eyes were a stormy gray, wide open, sharp with awareness that stopped me in my tracks. 1 second passed, then 2, and then he spoke. His voice was hoarse, strained, but steady. "Who are you?" I swallowed hard, stepped closer, my pulse pounding in my ears. "You were hurt. I found you here. You'd been shot. I took the bullet out." He stared at me for a long moment, then looked away, as if weighing something, calculating. I felt like I was being studied, like he was silently asking himself what kind of person I was, whether I was a threat, whether he could trust me. He said nothing more. I grabbed a chair and sat beside him, keeping a careful distance. The bleeding had stopped, but his skin was still pale, lips tinged with gray, sweat soaking the back of his shirt. I handed him a glass of water. His hand trembled, but he managed to drink without help. I asked him his name. For the first time, he looked me directly in the eyes. "Dominic Rivas," he said. The name was sharp, unusual, but it was enough to tell me he wasn't a John or a Steve or anyone who blended in. Dominic sounded sharp, unusual, something old, maybe Latin, and it stuck. I nodded. "I'm Grace Whitaker. I'm a veterinarian." The words fell out, and even to me, they sounded strange, almost like an apology. But Dominic only nodded, silent. Then he asked, "How long?" I glanced at the clock. "About 4 hours. I found you just before 3. I stitched the wound around 3:30. You've been unconscious since then." Dominic closed his eyes, rested his head back against the pillow, his face tight with something I couldn't quite name. I asked if he was in pain. He shook his head. A slight motion, not enough to tell me if he meant no, or if he just didn't want to admit yes. I could still see the swelling around the wound. His heart was still racing. I reached to check his forehead. He didn't flinch. His skin was cooler now, far better than before. He didn't ask what kind of drugs I'd used. He didn't ask why I hadn't called the police. And I didn't offer it. There was a kind of silent agreement forming between us, one without terms or conditions, but heavy all the same. I stood, pulled the blanket up over his shoulders, and started to walk away when he spoke again. "You shouldn't have helped me." I stopped, turned back. Maybe not. But I did. I couldn't let you die on my floor. He looked at me, longer this time, searching my face as if he might find some hidden answer there. Then he said, almost a whisper, "I owe you a life." It wasn't gratitude. It was something heavier, something that felt more like a pact than a thank you, a binding of two strangers who had just crossed the narrow line between life and death together in the quiet of a rain-soaked night. I walked slowly back to the living room. There was no relief in my chest, no sense of peace. I didn't know who this man was, where he had come from, or what had brought him to my doorstep in the dark, but I knew one thing without doubt. He was not an ordinary man, and from that moment on, I was no longer just an ordinary woman living an ordinary life. I didn't stray far from the garage. Even after I returned to the living room, trying to pretend it was an ordinary morning, pouring myself a cup of strong black coffee, switching on the news to fill the silence in the house, my mind remained anchored behind that door, where a man named Dominic Rivas lay just beyond reach. His name echoed in my head like a quiet, persistent warning. Dominic. When he had said it, his voice was low, rough, carrying something worn into its edges, short and sharp like an order. I had saved a man's life, and now he was here, inside my home, carrying with him a mystery far larger than I could make sense of. I had never heard that name before, but something in the way he looked at me, silent, alert, calculating but unafraid, told me he wasn't just a wounded stranger. He hadn't panicked, hadn't asked for a phone, hadn't tried to call anyone. He hadn't worried about the wound. As if being shot, bleeding on a stranger's concrete floor, waking up in a place that wasn't his own, was something he knew too well. After my daughter left for school, I returned to the garage. Dominic was still lying there, eyes open, sharp and steady, as if blood loss had never pulled him under. I checked the wound, replaced the bandage, checked his pulse and temperature. He said nothing, just watched me, occasionally offering a slight nod. I asked if there was someone he needed to contact, someone I could call for him. He looked at me, no panic in his eyes, only a calm weighing of whether to answer or not. Then he asked me something instead. "You really don't know who I am?" The question stopped me. I told him I had never seen him before, never heard the name Dominic Rivas. He nodded, as though that confirmed something he'd been waiting to know. Then, after a long pause, he said, I used to run a transport network, the kind of goods that weren't always legal. His voice was steady, without hesitation. I didn't react. I kept cleaning the wound. He continued, I had a lot of people working under me, a lot of money, a lot of power, but also a lot of enemies, and maybe one of them found me last night. I looked up at him. He hadn't used words like cartel or smuggling, but the way he spoke, the way he locked eyes with mine like he was measuring my response, told me he wasn't exaggerating. Dominic had once belonged to a world I had never even brushed up against. A world with its own rules, its own shadows. I didn't ask more. Not why he was in Charleston, not who had shot him, not why my house, because part of me wasn't sure I wanted to know the answers. After that short exchange, Dominic closed his eyes, and I stayed there a while longer, holding a mug of tea that had gone cold in my hands. In my mind, I kept seeing the bullet I had removed, the old scars on his arms, and the way he had spoken of power like something long since buried. I began to wonder what could drive a man like that to be ambushed in the middle of a rainstorm, to flee alone, bringing nothing with him but a torn suit and a wound meant to kill. Who was Dominic Rivas? Was he a fugitive? Or a man being hunted for something bigger than himself? Was he a fallen king of some hidden empire? Or someone trying to sever ties with a past that refused to let go? I didn't know. But I knew this much. I had brought him into my home, into the small, quiet world I shared with my daughter. And from that moment forward, there was no going back to the life I had known. That evening, as I sat alone in the kitchen, the old clock on the wall ticked with a slow, deliberate rhythm that echoed through the quiet house, and I realized I was standing in the space between two worlds. Instinct and reason. On one side was the woman I had always been, a single mother, accustomed to structure, to quiet routines and days that unfolded without disruption. On the other side was something shifting beneath the surface, something set in motion since that rain-soaked night. Dominic was still in the garage, where I had placed a space heater and hung a heavy curtain to keep out the chill. He hadn't asked for anything. No questions, no demands, but his presence had altered the very rhythm of this house, and the rhythm within me. In my head, reason was busy listing every possible risk. Dominic could be a criminal. He could carry with him a violent past and the enemies that came with it. He could drag me and my daughter into something far beyond our control. But instinct told another story. In him, I saw a quiet fatigue that couldn't be disguised, a crack in the silence, like the world had already turned its back on him, and this old garage was the last place left to lie down and breathe. Sometimes, I caught him staring through the small window near the ceiling, his eyes distant, heavy. There was no threat in them, no arrogance, just the silence of someone who had once held everything and then lost it. I wondered if he had children, if someone was waiting for him somewhere, but I didn't ask. We both seemed to understand the fragile boundary between curiosity and intrusion. Dominic didn't speak of his past, and I didn't dig. Still, I could feel the weight of his history in every bandage I changed, every moment my fingers touched the old scars that lined his skin. A body that had endured and resisted more than once. But this time felt different. He had let me save him. He had stayed still, hadn't fought. As if, for the first time, he no longer had the strength, or the will, to fight alone. I sat with him through long, wordless stretches. We listened to the wind rustling over the tin roof, the distant hum of passing cars, and sometimes, just the sound of our own slow breathing. I brought him a bowl of chicken porridge, the simplest thing I could cook in 20 minutes after picking up my daughter from school. He ate very little, but he tried. "Thank you," he murmured. It was the first time he'd said those words since waking up. I only nodded. I didn't reply. Because if I spoke, I might have to face all the feelings I was trying so hard to keep contained. That night, after putting my daughter to bed, I returned to the garage. I told Dominic I would sleep on the sofa near the front door in case he needed anything. He looked at me for a long moment, then said, "I won't cause trouble." I believed him. But the part that frightened me most wasn't the trouble he might bring. It was what was stirring inside me. I was beginning to feel something for a man I barely knew. A man who, with nothing more than a name, might alter the course of my entire life. My instinct wanted to protect him. My reason screamed that I was stepping into something I didn't understand. But between the two, there was a space I couldn't ignore. The hollow left by too many quiet years spent alone. And now, that space had found something real in the eyes of a man who hadn't asked for pity but somehow made me want to step closer, not out of duty, but because there was something in him I couldn't look away from. And that's when I understood. Sometimes, It isn't reason or instinct that leads us. It's something deeper, something beyond what reason can reach or instinct can name. I lay on the sofa in the living room, lights off, eyes wide open, fixed on the ceiling above. Outside, the wind pushed its way through the trees, making the glass doors tremble in rhythm with each gust. My daughter was asleep in her room, her breathing steady, the soft whirl of the ceiling fan the only thing anchoring me to the present moment. But my mind was trapped behind the door that led to the garage, where a stranger was lying in the middle of my world. The first night is always the hardest to sleep through, not because of fear, but because nothing can be undone anymore. Dominic Rivas was here, real, solid, breathing beneath my roof. He wasn't a name on the evening news or a character in a sensational headline. He was flesh and blood, alive because of my hands, and with each passing hour, his presence settled heavier into my thoughts. I'd lived through sleepless nights before, after my parents died, after the divorce, during long surgeries that stretched into morning. But no night had ever made me feel the line between right and wrong as clearly as this one. Dominic had become more lucid. He didn't talk much, just nodded when I checked the wound, winced quietly when the pain tugged at him, then fell back into silence like he was calculating something beneath the surface. I didn't know what he was thinking. Maybe how to leave. Maybe how to keep me from getting caught in whatever this was. But one thing was clear. He had never asked me for a single thing, not even to save him. And that, strangely, made me want to stay. Near 2 a.m, I couldn't stand the weight in my chest any longer. I left the sofa and walked quietly down into the garage. Dominic was still awake. The small lamp cast a soft glow around him, his shadow stretching long across the wall like a sliver of darkness shifting in the quiet. He turned his head as I entered. He wasn't surprised. He didn't speak at first. I sat down on the small wooden chair beside the cot. We looked at each other for a moment, and then he spoke. "You should sleep." "I know," I said. "But I can't." He nodded. "Me neither." The air between us felt like something suspended. Not tension, not closeness, just a stillness, heavy and watchful. I asked him if he was in pain. He shook his head. "It aches, but nothing serious. I think I've been through worse." The way he said it felt like another piece of a puzzle I still couldn't see clearly. I asked why he came here. Dominic went quiet again. Then he said, "I didn't choose this place. I just drove until I couldn't anymore. I was bleeding. And when I saw this house, the light in the window, I thought, if I had to die, I wanted someone to know I existed." I looked up at him, my chest tightening not from fear, but from understanding. I had felt that before too. That longing to be seen, to be known, for someone to touch your presence in a world that moves past without noticing. I asked him, "If tomorrow you woke up strong enough to leave, would you really go?" Dominic looked at me, unblinking. "Maybe, but not yet." I nodded, though I wasn't sure which answer I'd hoped for. We sat there a little longer, saying nothing more. Our shadows lay side by side on the cold garage floor, two people who, by all logic, should have had nothing to do with each other, now bound by a night of rain, a bullet, and a choice that couldn't be taken back. I left the garage when the clock showed 2:50. I still couldn't sleep. But this time, it wasn't out of worry. It was something else. Something stirring at the edge of all the rules I'd lived by. A quiet knowing, deep inside me, that tonight was the first step into something new. Not easy, not safe, but real, and irreversible. The next morning began with an unusual silence. No birdsong. No familiar hum of neighbors' cars rolling out of driveways. The air felt thick, as if the sky itself was holding its breath before a sudden storm. I woke just after 6, my body heavy, my mind dense with the weight of a restless night. After making breakfast for my daughter, I returned to the kitchen window, gently pulled back the curtain, and I saw it. A black car, parked across the street, directly facing my house. Still and silent, as though it had been there for hours. It wasn't a neighbor's car. Not the mailman's either. No one stepped out. No movement inside, at least not enough to make out a face. But I knew someone was there. That feeling crept along my spine like a cold wind. I stepped away from the window, schooling my expression before my daughter could notice anything in my face. After I dropped her off at school, I circled back to the neighborhood from another direction. The car was still there, unmoved. I slowed down as I passed, my eyes darting to the tinted windows. I couldn't see a thing. My heart pounded as the truth settled into my bones. I was being watched. It was no longer a suspicion. It was real. I rushed home, locked every door, pulled the curtains shut, then headed straight down to the garage. Dominic was sitting up, propped against the wall. His color was still pale, but the wound looked better. He looked up as I entered. Something wrong. His voice was low and alert. I told him about the car. He didn't react right away, just stared at the floor for a long moment, piecing something together in his mind. Then he stood, a bit unsteady from the injury, but holding his balance. "They found me." "Who?" I asked. He didn't answer immediately, just said, softly, "The ones who don't want me alive." And in that moment, something in him shifted. The quiet man from the night before, wounded, silent, was gone. In his place was someone sharper, colder. The calculation in his eyes returned like a blade being unsheathed. He stepped over to the workbench, opened a drawer I hadn't touched in years. Beneath layers of old tape and dusty tools, he pulled out a small, old flip phone. I didn't ask how long it had been hidden there. He dialed a number, spoke briefly in Spanish, then snapped the phone shut. "We don't have much time. They won't sit still for long." I stood frozen, fists clenched. I didn't ask more. I knew if Dominic wanted to tell me, he would. And if he didn't, there was no prying the truth from a man like him. Still, I needed to understand what I was facing. I needed to know how close the danger had come. I asked him, "Should I take my daughter and leave?" Dominic looked up at me. For the first time since this all began, his gaze softened. No edge, no coldness, just something human. "If I were you," he said, "I would. Today." And something inside me cracked. It felt like the ground shifting beneath my feet, like bedrock splitting open beneath a quiet life. I had known there was danger the moment I saw the bullet wound, but now I understood the danger had reached us. We were no longer safe within the illusion of normal. We were inside it now, too deep to deny it any longer. Dominic looked at me for a long time and said, "I'm sorry for pulling you into this." I said nothing. Not because I had already forgiven him, but because I knew, the moment I knelt beside him and saved his life, I had stepped across the line from bystander to part of the story, and now, someone was out there, watching us, waiting for the moment to strike. The question was no longer if it would happen. It was when. I began the morning with a level of vigilance I had never known before. Every sound in the neighborhood seemed louder. Every car that passed made me glance over my shoulder. Dominic was right. Time was no longer on our side. I took my daughter to school earlier than usual and told the office she would be out for a few days visiting family. It was the first lie I had ever told the school in over 10 years of living in Charleston, but it was also the most necessary one. When I returned home, I packed a few changes of clothes for her and hid the suitcase in the trunk of my car. Dominic was still in the garage. The wound was healing, but not enough for him to go anywhere. I couldn't leave him. But I also couldn't allow my daughter to face whatever was closing in. I hadn't yet figured out a plan when the thing I feared most arrived sooner than I'd expected. Just before noon, as I stepped outside to take out the trash, I saw it. A plain envelope tucked into the crack of the front door. No postmark, no return address. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper, the message scrawled in thick, uneven black marker. Just one sentence. "You're harboring a dead dog. Back off before it's too late." My chest tightened, and my fingers trembled as I held the note. I looked around. No one in sight. But the feeling of being watched was sharp, unmistakable, like someone standing right behind me, breathing on my neck. I ran back into the house, locked the door in 3 places, and headed straight for the garage. Dominic was standing now, one hand braced against the workbench, sweat gathering at his brow. He looked at me, saw my face, and immediately asked, "What happened?" I handed him the note. He read it in under 3 seconds, then crushed it in his fist. I asked, "Do you know who did this?" He didn't answer, just clenched the paper tighter, like he could strangle the sender through it. Then he looked up, and his voice was lower than I'd ever heard it. "They know I'm alive. They want to silence me. And now, they know I'm not alone. They'll use you to flush me out." I sank into the chair by the table, the cold sinking deep into my bones. For the first time in my life, I had been directly threatened. Not by story, not by suspicion, but me, my name, my doorstep. Dominic stepped closer, and for the first time, I saw something in his eyes that wasn't restraint, it was rage. "I told you to leave. You're not safe here anymore." But I couldn't leave. Not while he was still here, unable to defend himself. Not with no one else at his side. I didn't say the words, but when he looked at me, it was as if he heard them anyway. He sat down, still wincing from the pain, and placed a hand on my knee. His voice was steady. "I'll end this. I won't let anyone touch you, not even a single hair. His words made my heart clench, not out of fear, but from the weight of how far I'd come from the line I once called safe. I was a mother, a veterinarian, a woman who used to live a life built on calm, routine, and certainty. And now I was staring into something darker than anything I had prepared for. And there was no turning back. The name Dominic Rivas hadn't just altered the rhythm of my life. It was pulling me into the center of a storm I couldn't yet see the end of. And I knew one thing with absolute clarity: this wouldn't be the last time I was threatened. And next time, it might not be just a note inside an envelope. I started the day wrapped in a kind of alertness I had never experienced before. Every sound in the neighborhood felt amplified. Every passing car made me turn my head, half expecting eyes watching from behind the glass. Dominic had been right. We didn't have much time. I took my daughter to school earlier than usual, then told the office she would be taking a few days off to visit family. It was the first lie I had ever told the school in more than 10 years of living in Charleston, but it was the only lie that felt absolutely necessary. Back home, I tried to move through my routine as if nothing had changed. The veterinary clinic sat quietly beside the bakery, where townspeople gathered each morning to trade gossip and schedule their pets' checkups. To them, I was still Grace Whitaker, the steady, gentle vet who knew every dog's name on Main Street. They didn't know that the night before, I had sat trembling beside a man who was being hunted. I opened the clinic, flipped on the lights, powered up the computer. The sharp, clean scent of antiseptic filled the air and for a moment covered the unease that had clung to me since sunrise. Dominic had told me to keep my routine, to act as though nothing was wrong because whoever was watching us was waiting for a mistake. But pretending everything was normal was harder than it sounded. Every second felt like walking on glass. Around 9, I was examining a cat with a mild lung infection when the front door opened. A man stepped in. I looked up, the polite smile still fixed on my face until it froze. He wasn't one of my regular clients. His face was narrow, angular, his skin weathered by sun, his eyes hidden behind dark glasses he didn't bother to remove. He wore a leather jacket despite the warmth of the morning, one hand buried in his pocket. His voice, slow and deliberate, carried an Eastern accent. "I brought a dog to be checked." I nodded, keeping my tone even. "Of course. Please have a seat. I'll be right with you." But he didn't sit. He walked closer to the counter, his gaze sweeping across the room like he was mapping it. Then he spoke again. "You're Grace Whitaker." I froze, heart thudding so loud I could hear it in my ears. "Yes. Can I help you?" He didn't answer. His hand came out of his pocket, and I caught the faint gleam of metal. No one else in the room moved. He held something small and dark against his palm, compact, unmistakable. A gun. He leaned closer, his voice a quiet whisper that chilled the back of my neck. "You're coming with me. No shouting, no resistance, or the girl in the back gets the first bullet." My eyes flicked toward Kayla, my assistant, barely 20, standing in the prep room, startled by the sound of his voice. I swallowed hard and gave a slight nod. "Move," he said. I walked forward, clipboard in hand, clinging to it to keep my shaking fingers from showing. He stayed close behind me, pressing the gun into my back. Once outside, he steered me toward a silver car parked 2 blocks away. I didn't call for help. I didn't run. I couldn't gamble with Kayla's life. He pushed me into the passenger seat and pulled a black cloth over my head, tightening it just enough that I could still breathe but not turn my head. The car started moving, the tires whispering against the asphalt. I couldn't see, but my ears recorded everything: the faint music from the radio, the low crackle of a walkie-talkie, the murmur of a voice speaking to someone I couldn't hear. I counted my heartbeat. I counted the turns. All I had left was my mind, and the thin thread of calm I forced myself to hold on to. I didn't know if Dominic knew yet. I didn't know if the man behind the wheel belonged to the ones who had been watching the house or if he was from another faction entirely. But I knew, without question, that this wasn't a robbery, and it wasn't a mistake. I was the target, and the only reason I was being taken was because I had saved the life of someone they wanted gone forever. After what felt like 20 minutes, the car stopped. The door opened. I was yanked out, my shoes scraping against gravel, the smell of oil and rust thick in the air. A heavy door creaked open, metal hinges groaning, and I was shoved inside. A cold metal chair caught me behind the knees, and I fell into it as ropes tightened around my wrists. When the cloth was pulled from my head, light hit my eyes like a slap. I was in an old warehouse. The ceiling bulb flickered weakly. Oil stains spread like shadows across the floor. 3 men stood in front of me. None of them spoke. They just stared, as if measuring how long it would take to break me. I bit the inside of my cheek to stop my hands from trembling. My pulse roared in my ears, and beneath the fear, one thought pulsed steady and clear, beating like a promise. Dominic would find out, and when he did, he wouldn't let this stand. The air inside the warehouse hung thick, not with dust or moisture, but with a silence so heavy it felt alive, dense, humming with threat. The three men standing before me were different in build, but they shared the same expression in their eyes, a coldness that didn't bother hiding itself. I was tied to an old iron chair, wrists wrenched tight behind me with industrial plastic zip ties. The edges cut into my skin, burning where I had tried to move. I knew if I struggled too hard, they'd slice straight through flesh. Dominic received the video in the late afternoon, while he was sitting alone in the garage, the dull light filtering through the high window casting long shadows across the floor, illuminating the dried blood still clinging to the old blanket where he had once laid. His phone buzzed. A message, no sender, no words, just a single file, a video no longer than 30 seconds. He opened it without hesitation. The image hit him like a blow to the chest. Grace. She was sitting in a metal chair, her hands tied tightly behind her back, a faint bruise visible on her right cheek. There was no blood, no sign of fresh injury, but her eyes looked straight into the camera, steady and unflinching, calm in a way that chilled the bones, as if she knew Dominic was watching, as if she was holding herself upright for both of them. Behind her, a grimy warehouse wall stretched across the frame, paint peeling, flickering ceiling bulbs casting sickly halos of light. One of the men stepped into view, face half covered with a black scarf, voice clear and deliberate. "Dominic, you thought you could disappear. You thought I wouldn't find you. But you were wrong. You showed your one weakness, her." He walked closer to Grace and placed a hand on her shoulder. The gesture didn't need further explanation. Grace didn't flinch. Her gaze never shifted. Not a tear fell. The man continued. "You have 48 hours. Come back, or we'll send you pieces of her, one day at a time." Then he laughed. A dry, metallic sound, like something rusted being ground against stone. The screen went black. No demands for money, no offer of trade, no terms. This wasn't a negotiation. This was a declaration of war. Dominic stood still for several seconds, staring at the now dark screen. His lips were pressed into a thin, pale line. His fingers had curled into fists so tight his knuckles had gone white. But beneath the silence, a storm was rising, a tidal surge of rage, of fear, of something deeper and more devastating than pain. He had promised to protect her. He had believed he could vanish without a trace, cover his steps well enough to keep her safe. But they had done what even his oldest enemies had never managed. They had taken someone innocent for a debt that belonged to him. Dominic moved, swift, precise. He grabbed his coat from the chair, shoved the phone into his pocket. Then he went to the drawer in the corner of the garage and unlocked a metal box he had once sworn never to open again. Inside, a compact handgun, a folding knife, and a thin stack of weathered papers, names of those who were dead, those who were still alive, and those Dominic had once called brothers. He picked a name, pressed the number. A man's voice answered after a few rings. Dominic didn't waste time. "I need a location. And a car. I don't care what it costs." A beat of silence on the other end. Then the man asked, "What happened?" Dominic replied with 4 words. "They took Grace." After that, nothing else mattered. There was no room for hesitation, no room for rules, no room for mercy. Dominic knew himself. When they threatened him, he could walk away. When they shot him, he could disappear. But when they laid a hand on the life he owed, when they took the woman who had pulled him back from the edge, that was when the old demons woke up. And this time, they would spare no one. The car came to a stop behind an old gas station, where only a rusted metal frame and faded paint streaks clung to the crumbling walls. Dominic stepped out, hiding his injury beneath a black coat, his gaze sharp as a blade. He was no longer the man who had once collapsed in Grace's garage. He was, once again, Dominic Rivas of the old days, the man who could silence a room with nothing but a glance. In his hand was a map printed from satellite data. From the video clip, the sound, the direction of the light, and even the radio frequency caught in the final seconds, Dominic had traced the likely location where Grace was being held. A run-down warehouse in southern Charleston. Once a mechanic's garage abandoned after a fire nearly 10 years ago. Its name had long vanished from official records, but Dominic remembered it well. It had once been a cargo transfer point for a small smuggling crew, the perfect place for a hostage to disappear without a report. He popped open the trunk, pulled out a loaded handgun, and a set of communication earpieces. He wasn't going in alone. Though he'd walked away from the underworld years ago, there were still those who owed him. And one of them was Miguel, a former surveillance expert who had worked with him back in New Jersey. Miguel arrived 20 minutes late, driving an old brown van that looked worn on the outside but was packed with all the gear needed for a quiet breach. When he stepped out, he looked at Dominic for a long moment, as if searching to see how much of the man once called the Silent Wolf still remained. Dominic didn't explain. He only said one sentence: "They took her." Miguel nodded. That was all he needed. They both sat on the bench seat in the back of the van, unrolled the map, cross-referenced satellite imagery, calculated every possible entry point, every camera blind spot, and the safest approach that would still get them there fast. Dominic didn't opt for a head-on attack. He knew exactly who he was up against. These weren't street-level dealers. These were the remnants of the old organization he had dismantled because they were too cruel, too ruthless. They followed no code. They killed without hesitation. He planned every step like a surgeon preparing for high-risk surgery. From sunset timing, to wind direction, to muffle footsteps, even to the light mist forecasted for that night, just enough to mask movement if they needed a back exit. Miguel, the only man Dominic trusted now, was tasked with watching from a distance, managing communication, and stepping in if it all went sideways. They synced their watches. Set a rule: no gunfire unless absolutely necessary. Dominic knew what he carried into the night wasn't just weapons or tactics. It was a debt left unpaid. It was Grace's face in the video, the bruise on her cheek, the look in her eyes that never wavered. And it was the silent promise he'd made in her garage that no one would lay a hand on her, not even one strand of her hair. When the plan was set, Dominic stood and looked south, toward the faint glitter of the city lights flickering like fallen stars. His mind held no space for hesitation or fear. Only one question echoed like a drumbeat in his chest. Would he make it in time? Would he reach her before they touched the last sacred thing he still had? Dominic tightened his grip on the gun. The plan was ready. And so was he. Night fell over Charleston, bringing with it a creeping chill that slipped through every layer of clothing. The damp scent of the southern marshland clung to the air, making every movement feel heavier than usual. The clock struck 11:45 p.m. as Dominic shut the back door of the van. The red light from his phone blinked once before he shut off all signal-transmitting devices. From this moment on, all connection to the outside world was cut. On him, he carried only a pistol, a folding knife, a mini flashlight clipped to his shoulder, and a small earpiece linked directly to Miguel. Miguel's voice crackled quietly in his ear. Northeast wind. 2 men posted at the main entrance. One just stepped out for a smoke. Dominic crouched low, gliding along the edge of the crumbling brick wall of the warehouse. Every step he took was deliberate, silent, trace-free. His shadow moved swiftly through broken patches of darkness, blending seamlessly into the decay like a part of the night itself. He chose the rear entry, the one Miguel had confirmed as an old emergency exit with rusted hinges but still unlocked. Dominic eased the door open. The creaking sound made his chest tighten, but no response came from inside. He slipped through the gap and into a narrow hallway, where the only light came from a flickering bulb in the distance. He knew better than to assume silence meant safety. He'd seen too many men die for thinking quiet was a sign of peace. Gun in hand, eyes sweeping every dark corner, he moved in rhythm with his breath. Every step toward Grace tightened the invisible thread wound around his heart. Miguel reported again. One just left the side corridor. Might be on patrol. Left hallway leads to the main floor through a steel door. Dominic nodded instinctively, even though he knew Miguel couldn't see him. He moved forward, stopping at the steel door, placing one hand lightly on the handle. Voices drifted faintly through the thin wall, muffled conversation. He heard his name, a man's voice, rough and smug. "He'll come," the voice said. "And when he does, he'll see everything." Dominic didn't wait. He kicked the door open, gun raised as the hinges snapped. 2 men standing near the entrance didn't have time to react. One bullet hit the first in the shoulder, sending him crashing back against the wall. The second reached for his weapon, but Dominic was on him in an instant, disarming and slamming him to the ground. In under 10 seconds, both were down. Dominic rushed into the main room, the yellow overhead light casting harsh shadows across the cold concrete floor. At the center was Grace, still tied to a chair, her eyes wide with shock and panic the moment she saw him. "Dominic," she gasped, her voice cracking between breaths. He dropped to his knees, hands trembling as he worked to free her, eyes never leaving the door to the right where the blonde man had just stepped out, gun drawn. Dominic shoved Grace down to the floor and fired. The bullet hit the man's arm, sending him screaming and retreating behind the door. "Miguel," Dominic said urgently into the earpiece. "Back up? 2 minutes out. Hold your ground." Dominic pulled Grace behind a shattered brick wall, gripping her wrist tightly. "You okay?" She nodded, still breathing. He nodded back, eyes scanning. The blonde man had vanished down the right-hand corridor, 2 more following in his wake. Dominic reloaded, grabbed Grace's hand. "Stay with me." They began backing toward the rear exit, just as the sound of tires screeching echoed from outside. Miguel and his 2 backup men had arrived. Gunfire erupted louder now as the gang realized they were no longer alone. Dominic led Grace out the same way he came in. She stayed close, her legs shaking but never stopping. When the final door swung open, the night air hit their faces like a jolt of life. They were out. But Dominic knew this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. And tonight, he had officially stepped back into the world he tried to leave behind. But for Grace, he wouldn't take 1 step back. The car sped down the empty highway, its taillights stretching like red ribbons through the thick night. Dominic sat in the back seat, his hand locked tightly around Grace's, as if letting go for even a second might make her vanish. Beside him, Grace stared out the window, her face streaked with blood that wasn't hers, but her eyes remained bright, still alive. She hadn't said a word since they pulled her from the warehouse. Dominic didn't press her. The silence between them wasn't frightening. It was the kind that needed to exist for the air to settle, for the mind to grasp that something impossible had just become real. When the car turned off the main road onto a narrow path leading toward a safe house Miguel had secured, Dominic finally spoke. "I'm sorry." Grace turned to look at him. Her face held no anger, no blame, only an exhaustion she couldn't hide. And after a few seconds, she said, her voice rasping from a dry throat, "I'm still alive." Just that, a simple sentence that made Dominic look away. He didn't cry, but his hand curled into a fist, as if punishing himself. Miguel stopped the car and gave a quiet nod. "Go on." The cabin stood tucked deep within a pine forest, far removed from the city. No one knew about this place except a handful of Dominic's old contacts and now Grace. Inside, a warm yellow light flicked on. Wooden walls, an old but clean floor. Dominic guided Grace in and draped a blanket over her as she sank onto the sofa. She looked around, lips pressing into a thin line, then let out a faint laugh. "Didn't think I'd end up in the middle of a forest with a Mafia boss who once bled out in my garage." Dominic laughed too, but there was something broken underneath it. He sat beside her, quiet for a while, then said, "I thought I could disappear, leave everything behind and live quietly, like a shadow. But from the moment you saved me that night, everything changed. Not because you pulled me back, but because you showed me I can't keep running." Grace turned toward him. "I was scared, really scared, but what terrified me most wasn't being taken. It was the thought that you might not come." Dominic gripped her hand tighter. "I'll always come, no matter who tries to stop me, no matter how many times I get hit. I'll find you." Grace leaned her head against his shoulder. She didn't say anything else. Outside, fog crept across the glass. Inside, the fireplace crackled softly, the warmth slowly filling the room. No promises were spoken. None were needed. They both knew tonight marked a turning point, and the most important thing had already happened. "I'm still alive." That sentence wasn't just proof that Grace had made it through hell. It was a reminder that what Dominic thought he'd lost was still there. Life, belief, and a chance to begin again. 3 days after the rescue, the rain in Charleston still fell in a soft drizzle, though it no longer lingered like the night that had nearly shattered them. These late-season showers felt more like a quiet reminder. The storm had passed, but its weight remained in every breath, every touch between 2 people who had crossed the boundary between life and death. Dominic and Grace were living in a small wooden cabin deep in the woods, temporarily cut off from the rest of the world. No phone signal, no news, no internet. Only the sound of wind brushing past the porch, bird song at dawn, and the occasional sigh that escaped when memories returned without warning. Grace slept very little. Every time she closed her eyes, the warehouse came back the eyes of her captor, the scent of blood, the echoing footsteps in dark hallways. Dominic didn't ask questions. He just stayed close, brought her hot tea in the morning, draped a sweater over her shoulders when the wind shifted, and sat beside her when words simply wouldn't come. Miguel had left the morning after that night. He left behind a set of car keys, a folded map, and a short note. Asterisk. "You owe me a quiet drink someday." Asterisk. Dominic knew peace was temporary. The attack on Grace hadn't been an isolated act. The men who took her were still out there, and they wouldn't stop until they were stopped for good. But instead of preparing a swift retaliation, Dominic chose to stay. A few more days, just to be sure she was strong enough not just in body, but in spirit. One evening, just after the sun dipped behind the trees and the sky turned the soft hue of faded embers, Grace stepped out onto the porch, holding a cup of tea. Her bare feet touched the warm wooden steps. Dominic was tending the fire nearby. At the sound of her footsteps, he turned, his eyes softening when he saw her still, quiet, wrapped in an oversized sweater that nearly reached her knees, her hair brushing her shoulders. "I didn't think I'd survive long enough to see this," she said, voice quiet but certain. Dominic walked over, standing beside her. "You did more than survive," he replied. "You fought. You reminded me. There are still things worth coming back for." Grace looked at him, and for the first time, her eyes weren't clouded with fear or doubt. "Who you used to be, I don't need to know everything," she said. "But the man who walked into that warehouse wasn't the Dominic Rivas they feared. He was the man I trust." Dominic said nothing. He wasn't used to forgiveness coming so freely, but in that moment, he understood every journey can change course. And sometimes, the days after the storm are the true beginning of a new life. Tomorrow, they'd have to plan again. Think ahead. Face the enemies still lurking in the shadows. But tonight, under the soft glow of the porch light and the hum of insects circling the dark, there was only this: a man who had walked out of the darkness, and a woman who had saved him with nothing but her heart. Dominic woke earlier than usual. Outside, the sky was still wrapped in mist, the faint light from the east barely enough to outline the blurred edges of the wooden window frame. He stepped onto the porch, took a deep breath of the crisp morning air, and felt the chill breeze thread through his tousled hair and across his bare chest, still damp with the sweat of a restless sleep. The days spent with Grace in the small wooden cabin hidden deep in the forest had softened some of the darker edges in his mind. The vigilance was still there, his instincts as sharp as ever, as natural to him as blood flowing through his veins, but Dominic no longer lived like a man ready to strike before being struck. He had started to listen, to be silent when silence was needed, to make simple breakfasts with 2 fried eggs and slightly burnt toast, to wait quietly as Grace read a chapter of her book, then ask what had made her pause so long at a certain line. Dominic had never believed he could change. He had lived too long in the shadows, had seen too many betrayals, had killed without flinching, and had lost faith in anything resembling hope. But then, one woman, on a cold and rainy night, had opened the door to her garage without asking who he was, had stopped his bleeding without fear, had looked at him with the eyes of a doctor, not the wary gaze reserved for a criminal. That moment carved something into him that he could no longer deny. Sometimes, being seen not for who you were, but for who you could become, was the beginning of everything. Dominic didn't speak much about his past, but he had started to share small stories. Days of his youth in Brooklyn, growing up in a rundown apartment building where rules were a luxury. The first times he realized he had to fight to survive. And the day he walked away from the organization not out of fear, but because the cruelty had begun to strip away what little remained of his humanity. Grace didn't judge. She only listened. And when Dominic finished, she didn't say whether he had done right or wrong. She only said that his being here, trying, was already something precious. One afternoon, Dominic began rebuilding the back fence of the cabin. There was no need, no neighbors nearby, no one reckless enough to come close. But still, he did it. He drove each wooden post into the ground, tightened each strand of wire with his bare hands. When Grace asked why, he simply smiled. "Because I want to protect something," he said. "Not with a gun, but with ordinary things." She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded gently. In that instant, there was no need to say Dominic had changed. No declarations, no performances. The way he rose early, the way he chose the stove over the trigger, the way he sat under the porch and listened to the rain instead of the sound of gunfire. All of it was proof that the road back to light didn't have to be loud. It could be quiet, but deep and real. Dominic Rivas, once known as a ghost in the underworld, was now a man who knew how to towel dry the hair of the woman he loved after the rain. And sometimes, that alone was enough to change an entire life. A new life doesn't begin with grand declarations or brilliant celebrations. It arrives quietly like the morning light slipping through the wooden window frame each dawn, as gently as Grace's footsteps on the worn floorboards when she makes breakfast, and as certain as the nod Dominic gives each time he finishes fixing something around the house. They didn't move elsewhere. There was no need. The wooden cabin in the forest, once only a place to hide, had become a true home over time. Dominic built a small coop out back, where he kept a few chickens and a dog that Grace named Murphy. The first time Grace saw him laugh out loud was when Murphy stole one of his gloves and ran wild around the yard like he'd won a prize. She took a picture of that moment to remind him that even someone who once lived among blood and bullets could learn to laugh at the simplest of joys. Grace returned to her veterinary work, but only took a few cases each week, mostly from families near the mountain areas. Those who knew her called Dominic the quiet assistant with surprisingly skilled hands. No one asked where he came from. No one needed to. They saw how he carried an old cat from a truck without frightening it, how he stood still for an hour so a nervous dog could get used to his scent, and most of all, how his eyes always followed Grace, as if the moment she turned around, he'd be there. One day, while sweeping the yard, Grace paused to watch Dominic hammering stakes for a tomato trellis and asked, as if she'd been holding the question for a long time, "Did you ever think we'd get to this?" Dominic stood up, wiped his hands on his pants, walked over to her, and answered without hesitation, "Never, but now I don't want anything else." They didn't need to talk about a far-off future. No promises of forever, no legal papers. But each day that passed became part of a quiet commitment that they had chosen each other after everything else had seemed lost. Dominic still woke in the middle of the night sometimes, shaken by nightmares. Grace still touched her wrist when she passed through a dark hallway, where once it had been tied tight with zip ties. The wounds remained, but they were no longer open. They were scars. And scars don't hurt when you remember why they're there. A new life doesn't need to be perfect. It only needs to be real, to be full of care, and to carry enough courage to step out of the past without forgetting what brought you here. Dominic Rivas, once a hunted man, once collapsed at the door of a stranger's garage, now sat on the porch of his home, coffee in hand, eyes watching the woman who had pulled him from the blood and into the light. Grace, once a single mother just trying to survive the day, had learned how to love someone the world never dared to trust. And somehow, in a world that once felt too brutal for them to belong to each other, they stayed, not because they needed each other to survive, but because, with each other, they were more alive than they had ever been. That night, the power in the forest went out without warning. No storm, no strong wind, just a sudden silence that fell over the small wooden house nestled deep in the mountains. Dominic was washing his hands at the sink when the light vanished, leaving the kitchen bathed in a faint gray cast from the moonlight slipping through the cracks of the window. He stood still for a moment, then quietly stepped to the cupboard and took out 2 small candles and the lighter Grace always kept ready for nights like this. When the 2 flames flickered to life, their soft glow danced across the angles of his face. And when he turned around, Grace was already standing there, leaning against the doorway, smiling at him. She didn't say a word. She simply held out her hand, a quiet invitation without words. Dominic placed his hand in hers and let her guide him to the center of the kitchen, where the candlelight flickered against the old wooden floors, and the scent of dinner still lingered in the air. There was no music, no real waltz, only the slow steps of 2 people who had walked through loss, doubt, and fear, now learning to trust in the quiet moments. Dominic followed Grace's lead. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't precise, but it was real. His hand rested gently on her back, the other entwined with hers, hands that had once pulled her through darkness, had held her steady through pain, and now held her simply to dance in the light. They turned slowly in the small kitchen. Each step was an untold story, each glance an unspoken vow. No one needed to recall who they used to be, or what they had survived, or how much danger still lingered beyond the trees. Because in that moment, between flickering candlelight and steady breath in a quiet house, they had something Dominic never imagined he'd know again. Peace. None of us can rewind time. We can't erase the scars etched into our hearts, but we can learn to move forward with love, with faith, and with the silent dances of everyday life. The story of Dominic and Grace is not a fairy tale. It's a real cut of life where people who've fallen can rise again, where a single mother can become a hero, and where a man who once lived in shadows can learn to love in the light. If you're a single mom watching this video, or someone who's ever believed the past could never be rewritten, I hope you'll believe that there's always a chance to begin again, to love and to be loved. What do you think of this story? Did it stir something in your heart? Have you ever met someone like Grace or felt like Dominic? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your story. If this video touched you, please consider subscribing, liking, and sharing it with someone who needs a little hope today. At ***, dear single mom ***, we strive to bring you heartfelt, authentic, and inspiring stories every day. Thank you for spending this time with us. We wish you health, peace, and a life filled with light, no matter the weather outside. We'll see you in the next story. Take care.